Welcome to this lunchtime talk on pre-Christian votive deposits museum collections by Kevin Manvell. Thanks to him for doing this thought-provoking lecture. Please note that the views expressed in this lecture are the speaker's own and not those necessarily of the Heritage Service.
This talk is about pre-Christian votive objects and their role in the identity of museum visitors. The reason that it will only consider the idea of votive practice prior to Christianity is because with a change in religious practices and beliefs from pagan to Christian, the deposition of physical objects changed. Whilst we still deposit coins in wishing wells and hammer them into dead wood, hearkening back to an older belief, these practices are now mainly considered traditions and a bit of fun, rather than a serious way to communicate with the gods. This is the basic description of a votive object. So a votive offering or votive deposit is one or more objects displayed or deposited without the intention of recovery or use in a sacred place for religious purposes. Such offerings are generally made in order to gain favour with supernatural forces. There are three types of votive offering. You have grave goods, land offerings, and water offerings. Grave goods are any objects buried with the dead for them to benefit that person in an afterlife. Land offerings are objects that have been buried away from the water in the soil, and water offerings are objects that have been put into water. Where the offerings were made depended on the god or goddess you were asking favours from. There were, for instance, different gods for rivers, lakes, and seas. Votive practices have been part of human behaviour for a very long time. Kafka is the oldest burial site in the world found so far and is near Bethlehem in Israel. It dates to around 100,000 years before the Common Era, or BCE, and into the Middle Paleolithic period. A number of bodies and grave goods were found, including ochre to decorate the bodies and seashells for jewellery. The grave included the body of a child of around 12 who had had a massive brain trauma and survived for many years with what were probably severe mental and social impairments. It not only provides evidence that grave goods were used by some of our earliest ancestors, but gives us a window into how they lived and looked after each other in their communities and socially. This picture shows an artist's impression from a Mesolithic burial site from around 10,000 years BCE in Maglemose, Denmark, and it contained grave goods of ochre, a flint blade, and roe deer bones made into beads. It is one of my favourite images as it graphically shows how a young woman and baby were buried on the wing of a swan, obviously cared about and important to the people who buried them. The similarities between this site and Kafka are obvious and show the same use of ochre and jewellery for decorating the body. They are separated by a mere 90,000 years. 90,000 years of continuous similar practices. Grey Lake Sand Quarry in Middlezoy Parish, Somerset, is the earliest known burial site in Britain and dates to around 8,500 BCE. Grave goods found there included flint tools, axes, and pieces of pottery. At this time, Britain would have been recovering from the Ice Age, and people would have just started to settle here again. The Coryell Torvi people are believed to have purposely made and sunk the boat in this image, as a votive offering in the Mid-Iron Age, along with many other artefacts, including the Witham shield, axes, spears, and swords. These finds were from the River Witham between Washington, Fiskerton and Bardney, and, with the extraordinary amount of objects found in the river over a number of archaeological investigations, show that people had a very real and valuable relationship with that river, one that is thought to be highly religious and ceremonial. Some of these objects would have been so valuable, and it is believed that they would have been made with the sole intention of depositing them in the river as a gift to the gods. But what does this mean to people? For many of the large deposits, an equivalent for today would be buying a brand new BMW and driving it into a river. Not like this unfortunate person who may have thought their car could float, but happily intentionally and, probably, whilst being watched by a crowd with great ritual and ceremony. Votive objects represent a significant individual and community investment. Every one is a story that we can learn from. The Nettleton miniatures represent a change in votive deposition, from full-size to miniature objects. They are one of the most important finds of their type, because they show not just that the wealthy and influential were talking to their gods through conspicuous consumption, but that the ordinary people would also have been actively engaged in their beliefs. These miniatures include styles from the Bronze Age all the way through to a distinct Roman influence. That could mean that they had been deposited in the same place over a period of hundreds of years, or that these styles of weapons and tools were still commonplace between 100 years BCE and 100 years after. So why are votive objects important, and why should we care about what they meant to a people long gone and buried? Museums help people in their search for identity. We help people find their roots and a sense of belonging through understanding their genetic and historic journey to the present. Questions like, what makes us British? Who were my relatives? Are often asked and can only be answered through a deep understanding of our past. It is only through embracing that past honestly and accurately that we can get solid and perhaps accurate answers to those questions. Religion and ritual has been part of the human psyche for a very long time. Over 100,000 years, at least. By understanding what our ancestors believed, their hopes and fears, we become closer to them. We learn from them. We can be inspired by them. Museums, in the way they interpret their collections, have a significant influence on their visitors. Most of those visitors trust what museums tell them and are influenced and educated by their visit. Museums therefore have the responsibility to be governed by the highest ethical standards and to represent the past as accurately as possible. Unfortunately, this is not always the case, and many ghosts haunt museum collections across the world. Votive objects contain the hopes, fears, beliefs and aspirations of our ancestors. In a very real sense, they can tell us who people were and how they lived. They show us the decorative styles of their time and the craftsmanship of their makers. They show us the technology that people had access to. They are expressions both of communities and individuals. Interpreting belief is never easy. The museum community is itself influenced by institutions like museums and current archaeological understanding, which can often be flawed. Western archaeology is a scientifically based study of the past through agreed forms of analysis and investigation. Like any science, it involves a need for a general agreement on how to study and how to record the evidence. It is processual in that it follows a standardized and agreed process. But can we apply Western scientific investigation to a people who lived indigenously in Britain in a culture that was completely different to the one we now occupy? By looking at the way indigenous tribes live now and what they believe now, we can perhaps learn more about our own past. Native Americans, Aboriginals, Maori all see the world differently to the processual archaeologist. Time is different, the landscape has unfamiliar meanings, and their ancestors have a far greater significance. They have a view that considers archaeological evidence not as a neutral, two-dimensional scientific ideal, but subject to choice and interpretation, where cultural objects communicate ideas rather than simply offering a means to scientifically interrogate the past. This is considered to be post-processual and often conflicts with the way Western culture itself interprets the past. To some tribal and indigenous peoples, votive objects are often highly sacred. They are a contract between people and the land itself. Is it imaginable that our ancestors would have seen them in the same way? By opening our minds to more post-processual concepts, it is possible that we can understand more about who our ancestors really were and help people identify with them. Museums must be careful not to be simply a mouthpiece for historic, religious and colonial rhetoric and propaganda. Many museum collections in Britain contain contested artefacts acquired through the expansion of empire and the colonisation of other countries. Some museums have bluntly refused on numerous occasions reasonable requests for, amongst other things, the repatriation of grave goods belonging to indigenous peoples across the world. As institutions, museums can be guilty of epitomising the arrogance of the British Empire, inasmuch as they believe that they are better at looking after the past than countries and people who they consider less advanced. Some museums have argued that if they start to give back contested artefacts, their shelves will empty and there will be nothing left. However, there is a growing feeling that this is both immoral and illegal, and that some museums could be justifiably accused of keeping the proceeds of crime. Alice Proctor in The Guardian wrote in 2019 that the whole concept of the museum is a colonialist, imperialist fantasy, born from the fallacy that somehow the whole world can be neatly catalogued, contained in a single building, mapped out for easy digestion. She went on to say that those museums have to change. They can't be these cold, possessive spaces anymore. We need a new type of museum, one that's not afraid to admit it doesn't have all the answers and actually welcomes critique and dissent, that will let in a multiplicity of responses and voices without defensiveness. She said, "We need a different script on acquisition, possession and repatriation. It's not enough to insist that finders are keepers, or to hide behind outdated acts that don't actually prevent the disposal of objects." But it isn't just the way museums look at other countries' curious religious artifacts that is uncomfortable. The arrogance of the present often leads us to mock the past, reducing it to a time of ignorant savagery or foolish superstition. Votive practices across the world prove beyond doubt that people have had complex beliefs, rituals and communities for over 100,000 years. The stories we can take from these objects turn any notion of mockery and foolishness on its head. We really do need to take our past seriously. Often we can be led to see the past in ways that are glamorized and which can be incorrect. For instance, this interpretation board in the Collection Museum shows a romantic scene of a healthy, groomed, well-fed couple working in a peaceful village. They both have good clothing, are wealthy enough to have jewelry and tools. Obviously, they are living the dream. Tacitus, the Roman general and historian, reported that Britain had 3 big exports. Our hunting dogs were loved the world over, our woolen cloaks were excellent, warm and waterproof, and our slaves were valuable. So let's imagine a slightly different and altered scene. Still as romantic? The Celts sold people from other tribes that they had conquered as slaves. The truth may not always be pleasant or comfortable, but it does educate us. Entertaining people with meaningless glamour and rhetoric does not. Museums need to be places where the truth is told. They can and should be entertaining, but not at any cost. Certainly not at the expense of the past and our real identities. Many British people identify themselves as Anglo-Saxon, but why limit ourselves to such a small part of our history? Pre-Christian votive objects tell a story of human culture, society, community, and individual hopes and fears that spans over 100,000 years. They offer us a window into the distant past to see who we really were and where we really came from. An opportunity to gain a strong sense of identity that reflects our real rather than our preferred or imagined past. By looking at that past with a more open mind, rather than through the lens of modern culture and bias, we have an opportunity to understand the journey that we are all part of. Whilst there will be skeletons in the cupboards, there will be uncomfortable moments. There will also be the chance to understand where we came from and the amazing journey that has led you here to this moment today. Thank you very much for listening.
This film is part of the Investigate Learning's Archaeology Festival 2020 Going Digital. Thank you for listening.